Economy and Technology Summit 2022 in beautiful Kuala Lumpur. I'm sorry that I'm unable to be with you in person today, and I wish the summit well. Congratulations to old friends at KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, Tan Sri Dr. Michael Yeo, who is also a member of our Global Advisory Council of the Global Foundation. And also hello to Summit founder Tan Sri Dr. Lee Kim Yew and other official guests. Our session has been asked to address this topic: China and the world in the post-pandemic global economy, towards a shared future and sustainable prosperity. The subtext: how will the post-COVID global recovery lead to a new shared prosperity? How can China's recovery benefit the global economy? What are the key challenges and issues facing the world post-pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war? What will be the outlook for global economy? We have 6 outstanding panel speakers. 2 of them are still to join us, but I trust that they'll be with us by the time they're due to speak. I will briefly introduce each of them shortly and invite them to speak for a maximum of 5 minutes, giving us the benefit of their views on the topic. I will then pose questions to each of the panel before we open the floor to questions from those present at the summit. Please have your questions ready, keep them brief, and raise your hand to ensure we have the opportunity to invite you to pose your question. I'll then make some brief remarks before we close the session, I hope at the appointed time. Let me briefly introduce the topic to get us underway. Yesterday in Melbourne, Australia, from where I'm speaking, and online around the world, the Global Advisory Council of the Global Foundation held its final meeting for the year. Our Global Advisory Council includes Tan Sri Michael Yeo, Dr. Wang Heiyu, Henry Wang, Dr. Bing Zhang, and many other global figures, including Mr. Pascal Lamy, Ms. Helen Clark, Ms. Sharon Burrow. Against the backdrop of the divides that are opening up between East and West and North and South in the world, we discussed the state of globalization and the actions that we could mobilize together and separately to help ensure a renewed form of what we call cooperative globalization. This is exactly what your summit today is aiming to address. A meeting in Melbourne followed a meeting last week in Canberra between the leadership group of our foundation and the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, who led the Australian Labor Party to victory and formed Australia's national government last May. Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong, whom, as you know, comes from a Malaysian Chinese background, have been extremely active and positive in global and regional affairs since taking office 6 months ago, which is great news. The Prime Minister not only assured us that he intended to work closely with the Global Foundation, he also indicated to us, as he said elsewhere, that Australia will continue to play a leadership role in encouraging the great powers to work together, not draw further apart. In so doing, his government is already extremely active in Southeast Asia, in parts of our region where we all exist. For us, this is great news, as we all know that we need a world and a region of trade, investment, commerce, exchange, and people-to-people links in which China will be an active contributor and, to some extent at least, a leader. The Chinese diaspora across Asia and globally, including in Australia, has a vital role to play. That's why your summit and this session today is so important and timely. We do not have time to lose. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce and invite each of our distinguished panellists to address us. Gentlemen, I'm told that your full bios are already available to our guests, so I will only mention each of your names and titles in turn. And to remind you, you have a maximum of 5 minutes for your presentation. Thank you. Without further ado, our first speaker today is His Excellency Dr. Supachai Panichpakdi, former Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand and former Director General of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Dr. Supachai.
Thank you very much, Steve. I would be very straightforward. I have great concern with the present kind of complexities in the global situation that we are being faced with at the moment. Some of us are calling this situation the situation of a poly crisis. It's a crisis that is composed of so many different factors, and they're all not related to each other. They're not all economics. Some of them are non-economics. So while we are trying to resuscitate economies from pandemic-induced malaise, we would need more stimulus measures. But at the same time, we also have to cope with a war-induced scarcity. And so the measures that we are introducing, including the measures that would deal with the situation that has been worsened because of the pandemics, like expanding inequalities around the world, they're not always compatible with each other. At the same time, what we fear, and at the UN level, we have always raised the issues that while we're trying to meet the targets of SDGs, so development goals, we have to work together. Goal number 17, I think, is global partnership. We're not seeing this being realized at all at the moment. And maybe this is a step backward as well, because what we are seeing at the moment is the pace of deglobalization, of we staying apart and working at different levels and contrasting kind of economic policies. You can see the kind of interest rates tightenings in the West and in the East, in the less developed countries. They just couldn't cope because they are having to stimulate economy. They could not live so much with the lower demand and the lower amount of growth at the same time. So what I'm suggesting is that at the time of this crisis around, you look at the new book by our friend Rubini, The Dooms Doctors. He wrote a new book on, I think, global catastrophe or something like that. It's 10 catastrophes. He mentioned different catastrophes. So numerous: global climate change, debt crisis, geopolitical crisis, the trade tension between U.S. and China, and technology war, and things like that. Another colleague of ours, Larry Summers, he mentioned to us recently, he said this is the most complex, disparate, and cross-cutting set of challenges that he can remember in the last 40 years that he's been working. And I can go on, and the recent summits in Indonesia, G20 summits and APEC summits in Bangkok demonstrate actually the kind of concerns that the global leaders have. So I will conclude. The thing is that what we need at the moment is to turn back, not to turn back, but turn back the tide against globalization. You can see how the World Trade Organization is not functioning at the moment, functioning less so than before because of the kind of blockage by the US, the appointment of the appellate bodies, judges, and things like that. WHO, in charge of all the pandemic crisis, could not have functioned without the support of the membership. And I don't think it has received the kind of support from the advanced economy as much as it deserves. So I like to quote from what President Xi Jinping said in Bangkok just a couple of weeks ago during the APEC summit. He mentioned that we have been actually living off the benefit of APEC's openness, integration, and cooperation. I think these are three key terms. It's globalization, but we need openness. We need to keep trade open. We need to avoid trade restrictions on supply of medicine, of food. We need more integration so that there will be no borders to cross and less impediment to trade. And we need more cooperation. Yes. So he emphasized people-centered development and leave no one behind. He emphasized linking RCEP with CPTPP and DIPA, the Digital Economic Partnership. He also actually showcased the way that we could use BRI, the initiative, Belt and Road Initiative. And we need all of us to adopt environmental friendly development paths according to the SDGs as well. So these are things that I would like to reiterate as I would say, a concluding strategic move that I saw from President Xi Jinping's own remarks in Bangkok, and I fully support that. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Supachai. That's very strong and very clear, and you've raised a number of issues that we'll come back to in our question and discussion session. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Fan Gang. Dr. Fan is the president of the China Development Institute and director of the National Economic Research Institute in China. Dr. Fan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this summit. The title of our panel is about the post-pandemic, but China is not in the post. You may in the post, but we are not. The policies are changing, the adjustment are taking place. But before we reach the post-pandemic stage, we will have very, very real challenges in the next few months, I believe. But anyway, for the Chinese economy, which is not in a good shape now, we are facing quite a lot of the challenges. Pandemic is one. U.S.-China relationships is a very big issue. Geopolitical conflict and the global financial uncertainties, exchange rate, commodity prices, now the shrinking of the global market because of the hike of interest rate and all the challenges in the short run. So this year, Chinese economy is not going to be 4% growth, less than 4%. And next year, hopefully, they're getting better, but still, it's quite challenging. But at the moment, I think we should look at those more positive factors. I'm not going to talk about the global economy, but talking about, for example, the Chinese economy. We still have quite a good, positive things. First of all, China is not in a bad position in the global economy. Our inflation is low, so that gives the room for the policy maneuver. And we still have a very strong export. We have a surplus. Some other countries now turn surplus to the deficit. We still have a very strong surplus, and Chinese yuan have been relatively stable. So all those are quite positive for the long run growth. And also the second part of this positive things is we have some new global engines. The growth engines. Technology development industries. This year, China's export of the automobiles reached a very high level and surpassed Germany and almost reached the level of Japan to export the automobiles. And China's technology and equipment for the new energies are quite productive. The panel, solar panels, the wind technology, the storage, the batteries, all those things are very strong development, and that's for the future is very positive. And other things, biotechnology, AI, all those things, digitalization of industries, particularly manufacturing industries, is on the way in a very good positive, the changes. And the third part of the positive is that China need more opening up and globalization and multinationalism. China now is content by some large economies, decouple, some economies try to decouple from China. And then China need more to open up, to have more corporations international, in the international market. So that's why China have a new formula for the opening up. That's called the institutionalized opening up, which included more engagement in the international cooperation. And RCEP started this year, had been running quite a while. And I think the very natural China's international globalization is to more open to the ASEAN countries. ASEAN now is the largest trade partner with China. So with the further opening up and other, I'm not going to talk details, very much, on the service sector, financial sector, the China, in the past 2 years have been really institutionalized a lot of the opening up. So hopefully, in the long run, I think I'm optimistic China will come back to the growth track, and hopefully with more international cooperation engaged with other countries. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fan, and we'll look forward to hearing from you in the question period, because you turn from slightly, not negative, but a difficult situation to saying there is a lot of positives to look forward to. Some are being achieved. This idea of China going through this new formula of institutionalized opening up is very interesting, and we can discuss that when we come back to it. Let's go to our next speaker, an old friend, Dr. Wang Heyou, Henry Wang, who is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization and former counselor to the China State Council. Henry, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's great to see you again, and also all the distinguished panelists. And it's also great to attend this great event. Thanks for the invitation. I think I agree. I echo quite a lot, feel what the previous speakers' views. I think the globalization needs to be strengthened, and we need to really institutionalize more mechanism to promote that. I think there's several observations from my personal point. First, I think that globalization is at a crossroad, but if you're talking from Chinese point of view, I think now we are probably seeing at the end, light at the end of a tunnel now. I think that Dr. Fan mentioned, China is not in the post-COVID period, but it's starting to turn around now, and we see now in Beijing you don't need a PCR test to go to any office buildings now or public venues. So that's a great thing, and there's no more zero COVID emphasized anymore by a vice premier last week now. So I think things starting turning around, and our office has resumed full functions work now since this week. So I'm glad to see that finally, even though now China has the highest number of cases, but then there was no more tight situation like we used to see in the past. So that's first point. I think that really going to lead to a great retaliatory economic growth. So I would say next year, China should at least have 5% or 6% growth. That would be good news for the globalization and for the regional development. So that's number one point that I would like to make. Number two is that I see China now starting to really busy engage global leaders and dialogues and visits. President Xi actually today is going to Saudi Arabia to attend China Arabic Summit, and he just come back from APEC, G20, and we had a parade of global leaders visiting China, about 7, 8 of them just in the last 1 month. Of course, we're going to have just last week, President Michel of EU was in town, and maybe in January we'll have President Macron coming. So I see that China, actively re-engage the world leaders in face-to-face meetings would be a great momentum that that we're going to probably make things, put things forward. Thirdly, I think that with the Asia Pacific really fast developing economy, China being one of the backbone of this support. So we would like to see more of RCEP playing more positive roles, and then CPTPP, that China really can get more into the discussion, and also including the digital DIPA, that we can get into that. So that would be really also very, very important. And of course, we're going to see China going to hold its third Belt and Road International Conference next year, as President Xi announced, talked about in APEC in Thailand. So I think there's a momentum that's starting to build up, and China probably could play more active role in terms of leading this globalizing, more inclusive, more supportive of all the economy. And finally, I'd like to say, I think Asia is the biggest engine, probably in the world ASEAN now is, one of the largest trading partners with China. The integration of the region, is really important. So we shouldn't have those decoupling or cold war mentality. Really, influence. I'm glad to see China, Japan, Korea is also in some talks, and so we hope that we can really revive this multilateral spirit and really put things forward. And so I think, I'm glad to see Asia Pacific Summit. APAC has been really first time have such a re-emphasized Asia Pacific, which is a very mature, very developed. So let's really work on this APAC, RCEP, CPTPP. But eventually we have FTAP, so that China could, the US can work together. And also I hope that China EU comprehensive agreement on investment, the KAI, can be revived as well. So let's have more of this kind of a dialogue. So I really appreciate what Dr. Shupa just mentioned, that WTO should be strengthened. We see some progress at the MC12 minister meeting. We heard from Pastor Galami yesterday, also mentioned that. But that's really, Steve is really also pushing for the globalization. Let's get all the efforts so we can really also put a floor to this deteriorating downward spiral of globalization. And let's make it a new inclusive globalization forward. So I think this meeting is really great. I think we can really, with China, finally turning around, with the world isolation seems coming to the end. Let's get the optimism back into the narrative, and let's really push forward for the more high-speed development. I think by the time next year, if China revive the tourism, China used to have 150 million outbound tourists. So let China really open that, and then really unleash this power of traveling around the world and welcome more foreigners coming to China. I'm sure the quarantine will come down very soon now. So let's hope that we are seeing progress, and we hope to make it more effective for our friends around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. And yes, that's a positive spirit that you're displaying and living with your work, which I know very well. Just before I go to our next speaker, can I just ask the organisers if we have been able to connect Professor Syed Munir Kazru, who I don't see on screen. He is due to follow after the next two speakers, but if he's not with us, we'll continue. So with pleasure, I go now to our fourth speaker, Dr. Li Wei. He is the Professor of Economics and Associate Dean, Director of China Economy and Sustainable Development Centre at the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business. I happen to know the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business well because the Dean was with us at our meeting in Melbourne yesterday. Dr. Li Wei, welcome to you. Unmute.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve, and thanks for the organizer for including me in such an important meeting. What I'll start with a comment on the COVID situation in China. Even though the COVID situation is not resolved yet, but China is, like Dr. Henry and Dr. Fan mentioned, that we're moving into the right direction. We are opening up many of the restrictions and from the zero COVID policy. So this is going to have, in the short term, perhaps a little softening of the economy, and but in the long run, we believe it will lead to more robust development and more growth in probably 6 months from now. And I think that's what we should expect from China. And with that, I think one thing we ought to realize that China will make a lot of contributions into some of the problems we see today. Number one is the high inflation in the developed countries, and with the Chinese goods now in the near future will be more freely available in many Western countries, and their inflation will likely be more in control. And I think one of the things we learned from the past is that the China, with more than I think 200 million Chinese getting on the global marketplace as workers, and they have contributed greatly to the global supply. And we didn't realize how important that was until the COVID-19 pandemic and the trade war with the United States. And In the past, with such increase in supply, and China has contributed to much lower inflation, and in many cases deflation in some countries, which led to very aggressive monetary policy response. And now that those monetary policy responses are coming back to haunt us, which also led to, I think, the bankruptcy of this so-called modern monetary policy, modern monetary theory, which literally suggests that the central banks in Western countries can just keep on printing money and without consequence. And now we see that perhaps the reason that we could maintain low interest rates and for so long has a lot to do with the fact that China and many other developing countries has coming online as a global supplier. And then with the Chinese economy reopening, and I think those situations could be reduced as well. So that's one positive thing looking forward. And also Henry mentioned that the millions of Chinese will visit other countries. And so as China reopens and the Chinese consumers will regain their confidence, and so the global demand will also be added by the Chinese consumer. So I think that's going to be a great contribution from China to the rest of the world, in particular to ASEAN countries where Chinese consumer tends to visit first and in large numbers. And so those are important contributions to the regional development. The other thing I think is very important is technology, right? The whole reason that hundreds of millions of Chinese and also hundreds of millions of Indians and other ASEAN countries workers can join online in the global supply chain has to do with technology, right? With the digitalization in manufacturing and services, many more unskilled workers can operate, and those dumb machines, right? Those machines are dumb because they are computer aided. And as a result, the global supply chain is greatly enhanced because of new technology. And of course, that has political consequences in developed countries as well, partly because of the skill in Western countries become less relevant with computer-aided manufacturing and services. But that's something that we, in the future, inclusive growth, inclusive globalization will have to address. How do we maintain high growth and also help other countries with job preservation and perhaps and also China is moving in another direction, which I think is very important, which is to encourage more consumption and to change the Chinese economic structure away from heavily dependent on investments to one that dependent on consumption. And I think that change will be slow, but it's gradually, I think, moving in the right direction. And those are things that we see in the longer future. And I think a re-globalization and re-engagement and bringing the world together in a more inclusive growth. And I think that's a trend that's not just good for China, but it's good for our China's neighbors as well as China's other trading partners as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. And I think, some interesting observations, including the MMT, modern monetary theory bankruptcy was a so we'll come back, but also your use of the term reglobalization. It's a term that is being increasingly used. I was with the current Director General of the World Trade Organization just 2 weeks ago, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and she is very strongly using that term. So we might come back to language and common language as part of our discussion about how we move forward. Thank you very much. I now invite, and I think you have a slide presentation to support you, Dr. Edward Tse, the founder and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company in China. I'm handing the floor to you, sir, and can the organisers please allow Dr. Tse to show his slides? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. As the slide is being put up, I can start talking given the time limitation. So thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Next page, please. Obviously, as all the speakers before me have already spoken about, there are lots of moving parts these days, and you are all familiar with these challenges and sort of developments in the world, including here in Asia. Next page. There are many moving parts, but in the new world, as we sort of talk about today, inevitably a number of things will take place, will happen. One is the technology. In my view, technology will continue to advance, and digital economy will play an even larger role than what's been so far. However, the digital divide, meaning the difference between the digital competence across countries, will actually worsen if it's not properly checked. So I think this is a very important element for many of the multilateral organizations to pay attention to. Second is, regardless of what some countries may want to think about, a multipolar world order will likely emerge. It may not emerge in full-fledged. In my view, it would emerge in some kind of fashion. Number three is, we're already beginning to see the global US dollar dominance is being chipped away. And I think that chipping away will continue to happen, albeit perhaps slowly. It is probably not going to happen in a very dramatic manner, but nonetheless, this direction is already very clear. Number four, environmental climate issues are getting global attention, but progress varies greatly across countries. I think we all know that. It depends on the ability of countries to address these kind of issues. And it's not going to be easy to reach a consensus across all countries on how to deal with these global issues. While, in my view, while forces to partition, what a lot of people call it decoupling, will be around. There are forces that will drive decoupling. However, in my work with many of my clients who are CEOs and senior leaders of big corporations, in general, companies are not looking for decoupling. Companies across the world are looking for more collaboration, and they're making decisions on more rational basis than perhaps some politicians. So I believe that forces to unite will stay in the new world and will continue to manifest. Next page. In this context, China's role will become even more important. It's already the largest trading nation with a large number of countries. We all know that. Chinese-style modernization, which is now epitomized by the Chinese leadership as the framework for making progress in a new era with speed and intensity. And this actually is a continuation of the thought process of the Chinese leaders over the last decade or so in its search for the modernity with Chinese characteristics. But now they've turned it formally as Chinese-style modernization, which is a comprehensive and inclusive way of thinking about how to make progress for countries, but also for humanity. China could become the anchor for what I call globalization 2.0. We can also call it re-globalization, but I believe that globalization 2.0 would be different fundamentally than what we saw in what I call globalization 1.0 in the last 30 years. But nonetheless, in my view, the logic will push for globalization going forward. And in this new era of globalization, China would become even more important and could become even the anchor of it.
30 seconds, thank you.
Yeah, okay, right away. China's innovation will create significant impact in other parts of the world, including in Asia, in particular in Asia, actually. An increasing prominent role of global affairs, regional blocs, and BRI. Next page, finally. In my view, business logic, I'm talking about business leaders. Global companies are a major force in the world. It's not only about politicians or countries, but global businesses also play a major role. Ultimately, business logic will prevail. Global issues like climate change, pandemic will affect everyone. Megatrends such as great power, arms race, technology, digital divide are creating bigger gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Globalization 1.0 benefited many people in the world. Globalization 2.0 is a much better vision than small clubs with friends. Finally, creating a shared future for the humankind requires wisdom from political leaders, but business leaders will always make the decisions based on business logic. That's the end of it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much indeed for what I would call a lot of wisdom in your presentation. And let's return to those topics in the questions and discussion session, which are very positive and also very encouraging. And I see some patterns emerging from our speakers. Now, the good news is that our sixth speaker is with us. He's actually physically present and I think online, Professor Syed Munir Kazru, the chairman of the Institute for Policy, Advocacy and Governance in Bangladesh. Over to you, Professor Kazru.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of Global Chinese Economic and Technology Summit. It's good to be back in the I wouldn't say post-pandemic, we're getting out of there, we are not yet, and good to see many of the friends and colleagues around. And I was listening carefully to some of my previous speakers. So in the next 4 or 5 minutes, what I'll try to do is to give you a quick recap of what's happening globally, particularly in the sphere of developing countries, what are some of the immediate challenges, and what China specifically can do. We live in rather very interesting times. On one hand, we have the digital transformation, and we all of us know that how the pandemic has really accelerated digital transformation, and the growth has been phenomenal. I mean, if you look at the last 2 years, the growth of internet users jumped somewhere between 17 to 20%, whereas it was only 7 to 8% in the pre-pandemic years. But what has happened, unfortunately, though, because of the pandemic, many of the developing economies have taken a heavy hit. And the Sustainable Development Goal, SDGs, as we know, the Agenda 2030, is far, far behind the schedule and hanging by the thread. And many of the progress we have achieved in the MDGs have taken a reverse turn. So what has happened, many developing countries, which were hovering around 5% growth before the pandemic, has shrunk into below 3%. And add to that the Ukraine war, the supply chain disruptions, the soaring energy prices, food prices. These are rather very challenging times. And we are in a situation where people in Europe are struggling how they're going to cope with the winter. And we are seeing from Europe to Asia, people scrabbling for energy sources. At the same time, many people in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, struggling to put food in their table. So we have a very diametrically opposite world that we are moving, unfortunately, as opposed to the post-pandemic recovery, reboot, and transformation that we are hoping for. So these are rather very interesting geopolitical situations, and you cannot sort of isolate one with the another. These are very highly interconnected. So we are having impact on inflation. We are heading towards recession. So it will take a while before we are out of the woods. And in this challenging situation, unfortunately, we are entering more and more in a rather divisive world. Being the co-chair of task forces under both G20, which you know represent 20 most powerful economies of the world, and also G7, the 7 industrialized democratic societies, I have had the opportunity to spearhead SDG, digital transformation and global governance. And in course of my work, I have seen, unfortunately, we are charting into a world where we are getting sharply divided. What can China do? Okay. As we know, before the pandemic and everything, China in many cases was leading from the front. And in many instances, like the RCEP, China has done a great job, and sometimes I say it openly, in many cases, Chinese have outperformed the American economic diplomacy. So you have 15 countries with more than $12 trillion worth of market, and you have 2.5 billion people under RCEP, which gives a lot of room for optimism. So China has to lead from the front. And during the post-pandemic era, the trade, connectivity, those things are areas where China has a great opportunity to lead from the front. Having said that, I will be very frank as a friend of China. There are also issues with some of the things that happens. Take the case of Belt Road Initiative. It has come under a lot of scrutiny. There have been a lot of questions on the level of governance, accountability that goes on, which China needs to look very carefully. Otherwise, there is always a risk countries like Sri Lanka and others, which has been suffering fairly or unfairly, to a certain extent, the fingers will be pointed at China. So there needs to be more accountability governance. Secondly, China has also very commendably built the development arms. So Asian Infrastructure Bank, which now works in tandem with ADB World Bank, is a very good mechanism for China to help the developing countries. And also we have already seen AIB teaming up with ADB World Bank to extend development finance. And also China might wish to look into some of the debt relief it can give to many of the countries which are reeling under a lot of heavy debt burden. So this is the time to reboot, reinvent, re-energize, and China can easily lead from the front. Now, the Ukraine war definitely is taking a toll. I personally believe China is in a very good position to play a more effective diplomacy rather being looked into taking sides, because Ukraine has had very good economic relations with China and was one of the major export markets for Ukraine for cotton and other stuff. So there is no reason, given China's strong close relation with EU and others, it cannot play a mediating role. And this war needs to end for everybody's sake. And somehow we tend to sort of brush it aside, but unless this Ukraine war is out of the door, we will continue to linger to a lot of crises that we're seeing, energy, food, so on and so forth. And digital transformation is a big issue, and China can definitely play a big role here. There's a huge digital divide, even as we meet. The reality is 2 billion people in the world don't have mobile, 3 billion people don't have internet access. If we don't bridge this divide, it's going to have huge repercussions socially, economy, otherwise. You cannot have a world where half of the people are not connected to net, and most of us having access to online, e-commerce, e-health. This cannot go on. This will become a huge societal source of unrest if we don't shoot it down right now. China has done a great job within the country, and I'm sure it can transport that experience globally. So those would be my very initial remarks. But I remain to be optimistic, but I would say with a note of caution. These are rather very uncharted territories in the post-pandemic era. So we need to tread it with wisdom, caution, and with a lot of drive and energy. So with that, I'll lay my initial remarks and very happy to answer any questions or engage in the panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. That concludes our first 6 speakers and their presentations. And we have 30 minutes remaining in the session, which is a good thing. And firstly, we're going to have some interaction with the panelists and secondary observations I'm going to call for on the back of what each of you have just said in the opening remarks. And Dr. Supichai, coming back to you and your very significant roles that you've played in recent times. You're worried the poly crisis, the SDGs are not being realised, deglobalisation. The tide against globalisation is very strong. You didn't pull any punches, okay? You said Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping, you quoted President Xi at APEC saying, we've been living off the benefit. That's a phrase that really strikes me. What's the answer? What's the way forward? If you were back in your job at the WTO today, running the WTO in Geneva, what's the answer and the way forward in less than 2 minutes?
Steve, I would suggest at the moment 3 things.
Yep.
That should actually help to deal with what I call the poly crisis and to bring us back together in terms of trying to create this, what you said about the re-globalization process. The first one is that we should have the kind of summits. I mean, I have seen so many summits in my lifetime, and so many summits have been useful when leaders can meet and actually have a dialogue to reconcile the differences. But the last few summits, I think we should not waste them. So my first suggestion is that if we can work towards maybe UN-sponsored summits or any summits that already exist with very specific topic. For example, at the moment, food security. I like the G20 attitude in Bali very much, because Indonesians very smart. They started off with this kind of issue of the impact of global climate change on economic development, and particularly food crisis could be one of the things. So I would like to suggest, and we have had several food crisis meetings in the past, but this one is more imminent, not only because of the lack of the production of food supply, but because of the trade restrictions. And much as we are trying to convince countries not to put up any restriction on food trade, I mean, export constraints on food supply has been quite damaging in the past. So I would suggest the first one is to have a specific summit on food supply. Second one, I think it was Professor Cressy or some of us, we've been talking about China's role in trying to lessen the debt crisis. I mean, at the moment, a global debt pile is about nearly 4 times, 3.5 times the global output. This is critical. This could be catastrophic. So we need some sort of another debt relief kind of exercise again. And the UN used to organize debt relief sometime like 20 years ago, particularly aimed at African countries. But these days, I'm looking at China, because China has already extended so many loans to some of the poor countries. And maybe it's a time for China and some of these countries, particularly the poorest one, the LDC, could come to terms on, well, debt relief, debt forgiveness, or whatever kind of rescheduling of the debt. This is my second. And the third one, we need urgent reform of the World Trade Organization. And I think the present Director General would agree with me that with the state of the trade at the moment, next year trade is predicted to grow by only 1%. It will be close to contracting again, which is well nigh impossible for this world, because we need trade to expand so that we could resuscitate recovery. So we need to reform WTO in a serious way, and not only to do reform of the WTO, to do something against the Chinese economy, because it seems to be that the proposals of the Western countries to reform is all about state-owned enterprises and subsidies and technology thefts and all this sort of thing. I think we have to be honest with the way that the WTO has to function well in terms of getting everyone to be heard and getting on terms with a real situation at the moment, which is a crisis in medicine supply, the application of TRIPS, and all the sort of things. So we need to have a reform so that the WTO can be really operationalized again, and not because it could be blocked by some major economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Fan, turning to you in your earlier remarks, and let's go back to some things you said. China's moving from a challenging phase into a new growth phase. There are very good signs regarding, for example, global auto exports from China. Green tech is a major player for China. But you said fundamentally to me, China needs more opening up, more globalization. And you highlighted this by saying there's a new formula for China of what you call institutionalized opening up, and China playing a global role. Can you elaborate on what you mean and what is intended there and what we should be responding to?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I'm sorry. Well, fundamentally, we need to understand why China needs more opening up, more globalization. The fundamental reason is that China is still a developing country. Developing countries need to learn knowledges, technologies from others, all others, to speed up their own development. So that's what we call the latecomer advantage of the, backward countries. China now have some capabilities of innovation, but basically we are still in the stage of learning, stage of import, try to invite all the knowledges, technologies coming into the Chinese economy. So that's a fundamental. That's why when some country want to contain China, want to cut off, decouple and cut off the supply of technology, stop the academic exchanges, and even stop the, students go out, go to the certain professions. So, and China try to keep the door open, try to keep the inflows, not only the foreign direct investment, but also inflows of technology and the knowledges. That's fundamental reason from the point of view of economic, development economics. And then you talk about the institutionalization of the opening up. It's not a clear formula, but think about the three elements. Number one is the institutions of international treaties. Dr. Subachai is here. China benefit a great deal from WTO accession. And the reason for that is that WTO provide a binding international system for China. And China can use that to provide a kind of the rules of games for the domestic players. China has a big economy. It's managed by the different ministries and the different local government. They can behave very differently. But if you have international binding treaties, and then you provide the rules for those domestic players. So that's more transparent for investors as well, and the trade companies. And second element is about the so-called negative list, which has been used in recent years by the government, to have the direct, kind of the rules for the inviting foreign direct investment. So that's reducing that list, meaning more opening up. And that's also kind of the banding system domestically for the Chinese government institutions. And the third element is, of course, more regulations and the legal legislature on the trade, domestic, not only domestic market, but also for the trade, for the internet trading, and for the investment, foreign investment, provide more transparency for the investors. So from that point of view, things are still moving, and people are still working on that. And a lot of the institutions now have the kind of the research on how to go further open up. But you can see Chinese government now really doing something. Well, they support WTO reglobalization. They promote the RCEP in the past years, and then they now people talking about the CPTPP. Possible China joining the CPTPP, and all those kind of things. And China is now have a Hainan Island as a so-called the free port. That kind of development is quite a interesting for China to not only to have a more opening up of the trade system, but also provide more opportunities for the domestic regions to learn from those kind of the free trade system. So that's why I said it's a kind of a new frontier of the China's global engagement.
Thank you very much indeed. Elaboration, clarification. Wang Heiyu, Henry Wang, you are very positive and optimistic in your views. You are living the idea of globalization that needs to be strengthened with your work. Inclusive globalization, it's another way of seeing about reducing imbalances and uneven. And you've talked about the various trade agreements that can strengthen up the links that are weaker than they should be. And also you talked about China playing a bigger role in globalizing. What do you mean exactly? What could you add to the conversation so far that the role that China could play? I mean, I was involved in the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank very happily. Nearly every country came on board. Some didn't, and I'm delighted. I'm sorry that they did not, because they missed the boat. But what could be done to actually strengthen this international cooperation and institutional cooperation from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Steve. Good question. And I think that there's several ways. I think first is that we probably should help to reshape a bit of a narrative. I mean, we see some countries really propose that democracy versus autocracy. So that doesn't really explain the multipolar world we're living in right now. I mean, China has a unique model of hybrid economy. We have a private sector contributes 60% of GDP, and another 20% SOE does all the social work, and another 20% multinational foreign company does all the import export. So that's really unique Chinese style of modernization. And also, of course, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, and now it's talking about, how about making 300 million migrant workers into middle class? So that's another job China is doing now. So I think, first we got a narrative that really can be accepted by the world, and then, do not view China as a threat, as a problem. Second, I think also is that there's many things. I mean, climate change is certainly China can work. Definitely, China is now the biggest emission of carbon dioxide. It has to work with U.S. and other large emitters as well. So China, EU, U.S. should really demonstrate some leadership on that, and we can work together. Thirdly, I think that infrastructure is another common sense, the consensus we had around the world. China has a BRI already 10 years now, but then President Biden has B3W, and the EU has Global Gateway, and even G7 said infrastructure project. So why don't we have, AIB we mentioned about here, and World Bank and ADB, AFDB, all those development banks work together, have a big chunk of a BI and the B3W and the Global Gateway, and then really form a transparency and, let's find something to work together. And also digital. I mean, digital, US is the largest, China is the second, EU is the third. Let's work on the digital thing. So I'm thinking, that there's many areas. Of course, then we talk about energy, food crisis, and also some consensus on the justice, like China against the nuclear war, talking to Scholz and talking to Biden. I mean, that's a consensus of international community, and also respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. All those are great things. So we should really, have a common denominator and minimize the differences and find a few good projects to work on, revive the multilateral spirit, and have a new Bretton Woods moment, after 75 years of Bretton Woods. So I think many things we can work on, and dialogue like this and narrative like this is really important. So I appreciate that, APEC and ASEAN and RCEP, CPTPP, and all those mechanisms can play more role. AIB and BI, BCW, and all those mechanisms, put them together to strengthen the globalization architecture and mechanism.
Thanks, Henry. And in fact, one of the points you made was that I was very encouraged, as someone who's been involved in the global future on climate change and the need for cooperation, in which China has a major role to play, not just for China's sake, but for the world. It was very encouraging that China and the US are back together working on chairing the climate change working group under the G20. It was a brilliant initiative by Italy in the first place to put these two countries together. And, there's no future on issues that affect the global commons without China and the US working in some ways together. And your point is we should take a lead from those things where we can find agreement and work on those things that we have in common. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Lee, I did say earlier your comments about modern monetary theory and monetary policies in the West and the bankruptcy of modern monetary theory. That's very interesting because you said it very strongly, as well as quite positive things about the way in which technology is developing, China encouraging consumption over investment. Would you like to elaborate on monetary policy as it has been practiced, at least in the West in recent times? Because I think it's a very important point of difference that may need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very tough question, because one of the things we've been working on for many, many long years has been trying to understand why in the West we have very low interest rate for so long, and it didn't seem to bring out inflation. And that's really puzzling, and for quite some time. And I think the pandemic and also the China-US trade war created that opportunity for us to look at this, right? The pandemic in particular is like an earthquake. Without earthquake or volcanic activities, we would not have been able to figure out how the internal structure of the Earth is, right? We would not know that the Earth has, maybe a sort of a core and so on and so forth. And with that, with all those eruptions, and we have a better understanding. Now this pandemic is like a natural experiment, and it shows that with a global supply chain breakdown, and then with all the fiscal and monetary policy encouraging demand in the West, surely we had inflation. And so that notion that we could keep on printing money and without seeing inflation, and that era, I think, is ended abruptly and kind of unexpectedly, because when the policy was implemented, everybody was saying, no, it's not possible to have inflation because we had been doing this for years. There was no inflation. In fact, we were worried about deflation. But then with the supply restrictions, and we now have a better understanding. And so with that in mind, and I think one of the things now we have a better understanding about how the Chinese contribution to the world has been. And then we also have a better understanding now with perhaps the a profound misunderstanding of US policymakers about the Chinese economy. And one of the things in many of the WTO talks and American policymakers have been pointing out Chinese subsidies and so on and so forth, SOEs. And I think those, in many cases, are peanuts. They're looking at not the major issue. The major issue is not that China is subsidizing industries. And in fact, most of the subsidies that China provided for industries has not been that successful, just like in the US. But what has been successful has been the Chinese economic model, which sort of, and I think one thing has to do with the fact that China has this hukou system, and the other thing has to do with the Chinese land policy. And the land policy, which literally means that if you have a manufacturing plant, the land provided to you is at a very low cost. But if you have residential housing, and you have to pay very high prices, and which is really suppressing the consumer demand by having these people, Chinese consumers, having to save a lot of money in order to put down payment for their apartments. And that's really the key issue. And if you think about this, this is more of a subsidy on the factor prices and for the Chinese manufacturing. And that's the issue. And then China is now making changes to this policy, right? Because this certainly is not sustainable in the long run. In the future, it's not good for China as well, because this high rising housing prices to a level that's so high is really having a large negative impact on consumption in China, as we see. And it certainly didn't help with the international trade and so on and so forth. And so those are things I think China needs to change. And I think China is changing. I'm very encouraged. So coming on with the end of the COVID-19 restrictions, I think we should see more positive changes in China. And that has to do also with debt crisis, right? You mentioned earlier, we talked about the debt, mostly external debt. But in China, the internal debt are even larger, and they're tied with the housing. And so how do we resolve this? And it's a very important thing for the Chinese economy to grow in the long run and to move from middle income to the level of high income.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad you addressed the subject. And your point about subsidies is well made. I noticed the President of France has just been in Washington saying that the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is subsidising the growth of green tech in particular,
right,
enormous impact on the European economy. So nobody wins in the end through a subsidy war. So thank you very much. Conscious of time, we're within 10 minutes to run. Dr. Zhu, your speech I thought had great wisdom from your experience, but also you brought the benefit of being an advisor to major global companies. And there was a sort of compelling logic where you suggested that the global companies will make things work. It's the logic of business that things will not fall apart even if politics gets in the way. and you talked about globalization 2.0 and China rising in prominence in global and regional affairs. But you also, your wisdom was we're all in this together and a shared future for humankind. Would you just like to add a comment as a further observation to your earlier remarks?
Which aspect would you like me to comment on in particular?
And globalization will drive forward, even if politics is trying to take us the other way.
Certainly, certainly. I work with a large number of global businesses at a very senior level. And of course, every person would have his or her individual political take. Some of them may be on this side of the spectrum, some of them will be on this side of the spectrum. But they know, all of them is aware that their job is to promote and enhance shareholder value for the company. And therefore, they need to make rational decisions. And rational decisions meaning as measures of how much shareholder value will be increased during his or her reign in the company. And of course, that person or they will be supervised by the board of directors. So it's not just one individual making a decision, but it's a group of people making collective decisions on behalf of the company. Every industry is in very different position with respect to degree of globalization in tendency towards decoupling or recoupling or coupling and so on. So it varies by industry. But overwhelmingly, at least the clients that I work with and I talk to, they may have different political take on China and the West and so on and so forth. But their view is that, we're here to create value for our shareholders. Therefore, we need to have an environment that will work best for us. And what is the best environment? The best environment is actually a world that collaborates in a pretty unified manner. And one can call this globalization. And it's true, globalization of the first 30 years, of the last 30 years, actually worked very well for a lot of companies, including a lot of Western companies, American companies in particular. Chinese companies benefited a lot as well. So a lot of CEOs are asking, why not? Why not continue to have globalization? But we recognize the world has changed. It wasn't like 30 years ago, China was just a factory of the world or a workshop of the world. Today, China is a de facto supply center, but also a demand center increasingly because of the increasing size of the middle class and the ability to consume a lot of products and services. At the same time, China continues to manufacture for the rest of the world, in particular for the West. So in the globalization 2.0, China plays a dual role of being a center for supply and a center for demand, whereas perhaps the rest of the world, in particular the West, will continue to be a center of demand. In this context, any effort to try to put an abrupt change to this process wouldn't work, in my view, because companies do not agree with partitioning the world, because they know that if you don't play in the global, you cannot have the ability to play entirely on a global basis, your economics will suffer. If your market is a subsegment of the entire global market, you will suffer. If your scale of manufacturing is smaller than what it used to be when you are in a globalized world, your economics will also suffer. And so all these notions about so-called reshoring or friendshoring or forcing a certain company go from one place to another, it may sound good on paper. And companies are coming along in some cases because of one of the reasons, in particular politics reasons. But it wouldn't sustain from an economic standpoint. And so when would this happen? Right now, I think it's a pretty chaotic world, pretty turbulent. And we're probably going to see continued turbulence for the next 3-5 years. But over time, economics or business sense will drive things back to a certain era of normality. But that era of normality will fundamentally different than the previous years of normality. So what my advice to many of my clients, but also I think for many of the stakeholders in this game, is to really imagine how that future world would look like and prepare yourself right now for that future world. And of course, you need to pay attention to political rhetoric because they're real in many cases. But at the same time, also know what's going to be the fundamental logic that will move the world in a certain direction.
Thank you so much. That's very
you.
helpful. Thank you. We have a few minutes remaining for our sixth speaker, Professor Syed Munir Kazru. Would you like to make some final observations before we close, particularly, as you said, coming from Bangladesh from a developing country perspective, and you are seeing the struggles, the diametrically opposed pushes in geopolitical matters, and you're also seeing growth being affected in developing countries. And I think you're deeply worried about inequality and divisiveness growing between the developed world and the developing world. You play a role in it. What do we do? What's the silver bullet that we fire to make this better?
No, thank you. As you can fairly imagine, I mean, if I were to give an exhaustive list, we could have easily spent one full day, but I would tend to put it very precise and start with some low-hanging fruits. Geopolitics can get very complex, and unfortunately, in many ways, bad politics drives away good economics. That's the reality we live in. Now, if I were to given a choice, I think there are four areas where the world can start coming together, including countries like China and US taking the lead. Climate action is a big issue, and some of my previous speakers did mention how our Indonesian friends did a good job bringing US, China together during the last G20 summit. And G20 summit itself this year showed Indian relations were struggling to get joint communique at ministerial level meetings. So we are chartering a rather difficult course. So climate action is one, and then Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, if you ask me, I don't think COP27 went very well. There were more fossil fuel lobbyists than climate activists. There were a lot of no-shows from the big polluters. So climate action is something we can start coming together. Second would be food security. Because Africa is in a serious state, so is many other Asian countries. Food security is something where countries like China, US, EU can come together. How do we ensure nobody in 2022-23 dies of hunger and starvation? Whether it's Afghanistan or Africa, doesn't matter. Human lives are at stake. Third would be cyber governance. This is a big issue. We keep on talking about conventional nuclear weapons, not realizing the biggest threat is coming from the cyber world. And we don't have any rules of engagement. We talk about rules of engagement in the maritime navigation. We talk about rules of engagement in land-based warfare, but we don't talk about the cyber issues. This is a big-time threat. And so far, there doesn't exist any unified form of code of conduct for nations. Forget about countries or technology companies. This is something we need to come together. And fourth would be global health architecture. My last point, because the pandemic clearly showed the lack of clear global leadership. US was reeling under President Trump with no clear sense of direction. EU was fighting within itself with IP rules, who exports, who imports. So there was a clear lack of leadership during the pandemic, which led to, unfortunately, the death of 15 million people. Deaths could have been less, suffering could have been much less. So these are four areas which I think we can start coming together: climate action, food security, cyber governance, global health architecture. I think these would be four areas where hopefully we can try to come together as we try to recover from the pandemic years, as hopefully we try to move beyond the Ukraine war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for being concise in your 4 points. We are within 1 minute of our expected closing time, so we won't be able to take questions from the floor, I regret. But the flip side is that we've had brilliant contributions from these 6 panelists, all very skilled and expert, and also very frank in their observations and comments. I'm very grateful to you all for what you've had to say today. There are a few common threads I won't attempt to summarise in the short time left, but working together rather than apart will make a big difference. We have no choice. There are some issues that affect humanity as a whole, such as climate, feeding the world, cyber, even outer space issues like water, where we have no choice but to work together. Secondly, imagining a future without China involved at the centre is impossible. And therefore, we must do all we can to make sure China is both able and encouraged to be a global contributor and in some cases a global leader. And therefore, those who are involved from particularly this region of the world, in the corridor in which Asia lies, and I prefer to hear the term Asia-Pacific said more often. I hear other phrases used quite a lot. I think Asia still exists, and it's a very important corridor in the world in which I happen to live and most of us live in. So look, can I thank the organisers for bringing together quite a brilliant panel? Can I thank the panellists for outstanding contributions and some ideas that I think feed into the work of all of us, including our own work at the Global Foundation, chipping away on these global collaboration, whether it's globalisation 2.0, whether it's reglobalisation, cooperative globalisation, it is all the same thing. We need a world that's joined up, and it will be new and different, but we need to adhere to some principles of working together. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.